Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Hernandez. I wanted to do some review material for the students for the exam because I know you guys have a final coming up, and so I'm going to be going over some production theory, some of Marshall's laws that are in regards to the elasticity of demand for factor inputs, and I also want to go over some labor leisure along with their respective income and substitution effects, right? So I'm going to go over some of that. And yeah, let's get started. So let's start off by analyzing a simple Cobb-Douglas production function, right? So we have um, rho GP equals A K alpha L to the 1 minus alpha, right? So we could just analyze the returns to scale of the function. And we could see obviously right now that it has constant return to scale because if you take, if you analyze capital share of income and labor share of income, right, um, they essentially add up to one because the alphas cancel out, but let's just do it anyway. So we influence each factor of production by a factor of C, right? Influence each factor of production by a factor of C, right? Essentially, we get something that looks like this: A C to the alpha, K to the alpha, times C to the 1 minus alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha. And then over here, if we look at the C scale, we subtract the alphas, alpha minus alpha, we just get C times the production function itself. So we get AK alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha, right? So this is clearly constant returns to scale, right? Clearly constant returns to scale. And okay, if we do the diminishing returns test, essentially we get that the production function exhibits diminishing marginal product of labor and diminishing marginal product of capital, right? Or diminishing returns to capital or labor, depending on how you want to say it, right? Um, so let's do that very quickly, um, right? So if we analyze each factor production individually, right, let's just hold capital fixed, right? So if we take y equals c, some constant, because if capital is constant, then essentially this whole portion of this whole part of the term is just a constant. So c times L to the 1 minus alpha, right? And then we just do 1 minus alpha times c, and then L 1 minus alpha minus 1. We're essentially just taking a derivative, right, with respect to labor, right? And then this simplifies to get 1 minus alpha C to the, CL to the negative alpha, right? And, right, and then we essentially move the negative alpha down, so we get negative alpha times 1 minus alpha times C L to the negative alpha minus 1. So essentially, we're taking a negative coefficient of this, negative alpha times 1 minus alpha, and then we multiply it by the, the c that we were talking about earlier. So this essentially becomes a negative number. So because when we take the double derivative of this production function, right, and it turns out to be it turns out to be a negative number. The double derivative is a negative number, and essentially it satisfies diminishing returns, right? So essentially, it satisfies diminishing returns because this is a negative number, right? So what I mean by that is, okay, so we've done some analysis on our production function. Let's take it a bit of a different direction, right? So um, okay, so if we could do some analysis on the entire firm's production, it'll make that exercise a little bit more illuminating, right? So if we have a total product curve, it looks something like this, right? Total product curve looks something like that, right? Let's just call this point L1, call this point L1 from, okay, so, and then we obviously we're in the short run, right? Because we're holding capital fixed, right? So to analyze labor itself, right? From about 0 units, applying no units of labor to L1, right? We have increasing returns, and then from about L1 beyond, that's when you have a diminishing marginal productive labor. So essentially, what we were doing before is we were trying to find a double derivative, right? Holding capital fixed, and we're trying to see if it's negative to see if it satisfies diminishing returns, right? That is in regards to this point over here, L1, because beyond L1, right, we have what's called diminishing returns. Up until about this point over here, where the marginal product is 0, right? And essentially, we'll talk more about that later. And then beyond marginal product of 0, we have declining production and whatnot. So we could extrapolate this into talking about marginal product and average product, in which the maximum of the marginal product curve corresponds to essentially the inflection point of the total product curve, which is what we are trying to find before, right? The total product curve goes from convex to concave, right? At this point L1, right? And so essentially that corresponds to the maximum of the marginal product curve. And as I said before, that point where marginal product equals 0 corresponds to this point over here. Right, so this next marginal product, and then average product is of labor. I'm talking marginal product of labor, average product of labor. This is the maximum of the average product curve when the marginal product curve intersects the average product curve. That corresponds to the maximum of the average product curve. And so essentially essentially from here to here, that when the firm employs more workers, they enjoy increasing returns, and then they have diminishing returns to the labor input because typically, if we're in the short run, right, and we employ more workers to a fixed supply of capital, right, the marginal productivity of labor decreases. In other words, if you employ more workers, it yields less and less increases in output. That's essentially what diminishing marginal productive labor is. Right. So if we take this a step further, right, into a marginal cost curve, the maximum of the marginal product of labor curve, right, corresponds to the minimum marginal cost curve. Because if we enjoy increasing returns to labor from 0 to L1, then we enjoy decreasing marginal costs in that same interval, right? And succeeding that point, we have increasing marginal costs because we have diminishing marginal product of labor, right? And then, of course, this could be taken a step further to talk a little bit more about costs. Essentially, if we have, we're in the short runs, obviously we have fixed costs, right? We have fixed costs. This is supposed to be a horizontal line, right? Essentially, our fixed costs are independent of production. Our variable costs are not. So our variable costs up until here, we could keep going down from that L1 point, right? So we enjoy essentially concavity, right, of our variable costs, right, up until that L1 point where we have the inflection point, right? So we keep going down, and essentially once variable costs get to that point, we have a bit of a convexity going on, which means that up until that point, our cost structure starts to get a little bit easier, a little bit. It starts to ease because we're enjoying very productive employees. Basically, we're enjoying productive employees because they're essentially being matched up with units of capital very efficiently, and so that's explains the cost structure and the variable cost, and of course the total cost is exactly parallel to the variable costs, right? So this is an overview of costs, right? And Yeah, from here, we could essentially, if we have the marginal cost over here, that would explain a lot of the dynamics of the many different types of firms. For example, if you have a perfectly competitive firm, we have a horizontal price and marginal revenue curve. Um, and essentially, the intersection of the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve depend on essentially decide where they produce. Um, the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the average variable cost and the average total cost essentially are at the minimum of average variable cost and average total cost. So essentially, a lot of the costs for the firm depend on this marginal cost that we derived from the total product curve, right? So yeah, that's a bit of an overview of cost and production, and I'll move on to the next part of the review.